Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session this morning. My name is Sunny Wismer. I work with Brightworks Sustainability, and I'm really pleased this morning to facilitate a conversation on sustainability beyond buildings, looking at scope 3 and zero carbon and embodied carbon considerations with two really awesome subject matter experts and our fantastic clients, Jill and Sia. So I would love to give them a chance to now introduce themselves to you all. Jill, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. This is exciting. My name is Jill Ziegler. I work at Brookfield Properties. I head up ESG and sustainability for our North American development group, but I also work part-time with our global real estate ESG team on like top priority ESG efforts, including our net zero goal and commitment, ESG reporting, and all that good stuff, investor relations, things like that. So yeah, we are a Brookfield, just to give you some context before we jump into this, Brookfield is a very large global asset management company. Our real estate part of the business is our largest. It is global, as I mentioned, and we work on many different asset types across the world: office, logistics, multifamily, student housing, all that good stuff, retail. So most of what I talk about in this discussion is going to be focused on our development in North America, which includes primarily the US and Canada.
Awesome. Thanks, Jill. Stoked to have you here with us today. And now, Sia.
Well, hi, thanks for having me. So my name is Sia Zeros. I lead MasterCard's operational environmental sustainability kind of group and department and everything that goes along with it. So for us, MasterCard has a net zero goal for 2040 that includes our scope 1, 2, and 3. So that's, I think, what we're primarily here to talk about is that scope 3. Just to give you a little bit of understanding about our kind of scope 3 and our supply chain. 80% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our scope 3, and then 80% of those come from our supply chain. So we're really, really focused on supply chain work. We have doing everything from a variety of different engagements within different sectors. So real estate being one of them, embodied carbon, everything that we develop, all the way from marketing and advertising to technology. So we have a vast kind of variety of suppliers and supply chains, and we are working through engagement and then collaboration as well to make some progress. Also, kind of my department's responsible for all of our energy efficiency, all those other things. But so if you have any questions on that, happy to talk about that too. But no, we're focusing on scope 3.
Yes, and for this conversation, we are going to be focused on scope 3 and embodied carbon work. If you're interested in energy sourcing, so the scope 1 and 2 of either of these organizations, where we can probably answer some questions about that at the end, but we are really going to be diving into the wonderful world of embodied carbon and supply chain management and all of that fun stuff today. So if you're here for that, you're in the right place. And I think the first question that I wanted to pose to you both and understand a little bit more about this morning is, as you started to think about this really important part of your emissions, how did you figure out what to measure, and what did that process look like as you worked across the stakeholders in your organizations?
I can go first. So, so when we started looking, our first kind of, I want to say, foray or touch base into scope 3 was in 2016. That was the first year that we really started looking at what does a full greenhouse gas footprint look like. And I will tell you, in scope 3 and in supply chain, a lot of people are used to this amount of kilowatt hours, this amount of diesel used equals this greenhouse gas emission. I can find that factor. It's very data oriented. Everyone needs to forget that. That's out the window in the scope 3 world. I'll be very honest, gone. That's unfortunately doesn't necessarily exist, and the data accuracy is not going to be that to what we're used to in a lot of these other realms. But the first step is just starting tracking, like starting to look at it. There are a lot of tools out there that allow you to kind of get an idea, right? It doesn't need to be accurate, but in many cases, your scope 3 is going to be so large that 100 I know it's going to freak everybody out. 100,000 metric tons of CO2 is actually going to be not a big deal, and it's going to be a rounding error. So in terms of that, getting your first kind of data and at least trying, right? There are free tools out there. There's kind of methodologies in there, and start capturing all of these and use those free estimation tools, right? So there's Quantus online. There's other things that you can start using to get an idea of where your buckets are. Because once you have an idea of where you really need to focus and what is material, then you can start honing in on actually starting to get more detailed information, whether it be in the real estate world, so embodied carbon, whether it be from suppliers, so allocated emissions, energy intensity factors, using spend data, using invoice data. Those can come down later, but you need to understand where you need to kind of attack. I'll give you a great example. For MasterCard, we have a huge waste. We are trying to go for zero waste. That's all within scope 3. That waste percentage is such a small part that it's because we focus on it in a different area, but in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, it's not a place that we really need to focus on. So we really are diving much deeper into our supply chain than we are other areas. So that would be my first advice. Is it's going to be scary, and the unknown exists, and the unknown exists for everybody. There's no organization out there that has 100% figured out how to do scope 3 perfectly the way we know how to do scope 1 and 2. So that would be my first advice, is put the idea that like it needs to be perfect out the window and just start getting that baseline and figuring out where your largest contributor is, because it will depend on what kind of organization you are, where your largest scope 3 area will be.
Was that similar for you?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. Yeah, I mean, for us, it was very similar. I think even taking a step back, when we were first thinking about sustainability and ESG generally, years ago, we, mapped out our business's value chain, and then we figured out where the ESG topics kind of hitting and presenting themselves and presenting opportunities for reductions, and where they're presenting risk. And that included identifying greenhouse gases, like where are we managing those, or where do we need to be managing those and focusing on them. And once we had that determined, we conducted a full scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas inventory, as Sia said, to figure out like where are the buckets, and where should we be prioritizing, right? Like it might not be where we think, right? Maybe it's not our waste. That might be just like a drop in the bucket. There may be other areas that come to light that we need to focus on. And so we learned a lot. We learned that within the development business, pretty much all of our emissions are scope 3. There's very little scope 1 and 2. It's really just kind of like these spaces that we're leasing and operating. So it's, it's mostly scope 3, which is huge. And, for us as being part of just one sort of portfolio company in a very massive global asset management company, we also needed to consider, how we fit into that bigger puzzle, right? Because our parent company is actually the one that has the net zero goal, and we are a contributor to that, and really mapping out, what our emissions mean to us, our scope 1 and 2 and 3, but then also, our total emissions are actually our parent company's scope 3 in a way. So really figuring out those layers is important if you're part of a large organization or a subsidiary or something like that. I think that's something you should also keep in mind. And I also agree, you're never the to-do list with scope 3 emissions is very long, and it's never going to be perfect. You just kind of need to identify what you can impact, hit the low-hanging fruit, and take it from there.
Totally. Yeah, very well said. And I think it's really important to just get a lay of the landscape. As you were saying, Sia, you mentioned Quantus as a tool that you like. I'm gonna add in the chat one of my favorite, and this is very general, like so general as to be like not necessarily super useful beyond just an introductory resource, but when I'm working with our clients and colleagues and introducing them to just like what this is a resource from the EPA that I really like. It's got a really nice graphic that I find really useful. So just as a resource for all of you who are joining us today. So awesome. The next question then, which I think is very much tied into what you were both talking about, is once you felt like you had at least like a handle on, okay, this isn't perfect, but this is what we're going to measure for now. What were your key challenges in establishing a baseline for those measurements, excuse me, and what did you do to just tackle that and move forward in creating that baseline?
So I was going to say, I can go again, Jill, unless you want to.
Sure.
So again, for us, and we are very kind of open about how we've calculated our baseline. The majority of our baseline was calculated using information from, we call it true cost, based on spend data. So most of that was going to be, I think it's Sustainability One, now S&P. They have a data set that allows you to kind of do it by industry level, kind of SKUs and different things. They have a variety of emissions factors. That was kind of the best way, and we still use that today for some of our, a lot of our scope 3. What we really have now, once you get that, it allows you to kind of understand which suppliers to start engaging with, because the most accurate information is to get allocated emissions. So when we say allocated emissions, it's coming on the supplier based on the actual products and services that you're procuring through them. So for us, that is kind of the goal of data collection. There's of course one step after that that says, okay, now that you've allocated emissions, how can we partner and engage with you to ensure that you're setting science-based targets, to ensure that you're trying to reduce your emissions? But let's get that data first. So once you start getting that data, a lot of what we found is it's not actually disaccurate from some of the spend. Now, in some cases it is, but a lot of it has been very on par with the spend data and the information out there. What we've also seen is there's ways you can use already public reports. So rather than using a full estimation based on industry level, many companies and suppliers that are public, especially now coming with the SEC regulations, they will now have to start publishing an energy intensity unit. So once you have that energy intensity unit, you can start doing those calculations. So my first kind of our baseline and how to challenge was to get there was just to get that spend data, get that information in there, and then start really allocating and working with our suppliers to get more in depth and correct emissions. And that's kind of helped us hone in on what that true baseline looks like.
I'm seeing a lot of themes here, very similar themes come through from both of our experiences. You know, as a building developer who's designing and building buildings, as I said, a lot of our scope 3 emissions come from the building materials that we purchase and that we use to build our buildings. So we had a couple of challenges in measuring those. And first is, as Sia said, like getting that spend data. For us, we do have a center-led procurement team, but we also our development group has actually recently come together through a couple of different acquisitions and mergers. So we were still operating over the past few years trying to merge our processes. So for us, when we started working on getting scope 3 data, it lived in a few different places internally. And so we had great data in some parts of the business and like no data or not so great data in other parts of the business. So just getting everybody on the same systems from like an accounting and procurement standpoint was one challenge. And then once we're able to do that, we can get some accurate spend data and use some of the tools that we've already mentioned to approximate greenhouse gases and carbon associated with those materials. So yeah, just figuring out the data and getting our hands on it to making sure it's comprehensive was one. And I think, continuing on that, using those calculators for the actual spend data, as Sia mentioned, like sometimes it's pretty accurate, but sometimes we're actually doing some things to ensure that we are procuring materials that have lower embodied carbon. And so those tools don't necessarily capture that. So we want to make sure we're actually getting the data from the product. We want the environmental product declarations, or we want that intensity number or whatever it is. And so that's sort of step 2 for us. And we're working on that now is we have the spend data. So we have a baseline, but we know that's not, it's not truly accurate in some cases, right? We may be procuring better materials or different materials. So we want to get the actuals. And that's what we're working on now going forward is figuring out what's the actual impacts of specific products.
Yeah, absolutely. Finding that full bill of materials is really key in making sure that we're doing this accurately. I love that you highlighted that. That's something that obviously I'm very passionate about, and we are very passionate about at Brightworks. So love that. Cool, awesome. I think then the question, which I think is in some ways the question that sometimes makes this process really easy and sometimes makes it really difficult, is in thinking through the gathering of that data to figure out what to measure and establish that baseline, is how did you figure out who was a stakeholder in this process? And make sure you didn't leave, we've talked about leaving anything out, but leave anyone out. Because as I know you both like could write books and books on, it's so important to make sure that everyone is on board and excited and understands and sees the opportunity for the business and this work. So yeah, Jill, do you want to?
Sure, I'll take this one first. So yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, we understood, having kind of started our overall sustainability and ESG efforts years ago, we had done a, stakeholder evaluation, identified who those internal and external stakeholders are. So we had a place to start, right? But you have to get more granular, I think, when you're looking at greenhouse gases. You really have to dive deeply into your supply chains, for example. It's not just talking to them at a high level, it's really working with them one-on-one to make sure you're aligned on your goals. So we took kind of that general, materiality ESG stakeholder model and list, and we refined it to be more granular regarding scope 3 and emissions in general. And from there, I think the way we started was really to figure out, identify, what are our highest carbon impacts in our building supply chain and building material supply chain, and who are those suppliers and manufacturers that we're working with. So we sort of prioritized that list. But there's also, internal stakeholders that we needed to work more closely with. A good example for us is our construction teams. We hire general contractors, third party to construct our projects, but we do have an internal construction team who oversees them. They do pricing, things like that. They kind of oversee the entire process. And so that was a stakeholder who needed to be brought up to speed on greenhouse gases. What do they mean? What does scope 3 mean? How does their job impact it? They're the ones who are on the front lines of our projects. So they need to understand the goals, and they need to understand, when it comes to making tough decisions, for example, if you need to, value engineer something to save some money to hit your budget, or your contractor's trying to substitute something, they need to understand what your goals are so that we're not kind of losing sight of those during a project. So yeah, so I think you have to get pretty granular and understand, which of your stakeholders have an impact, like their decision making can impact your broader, net zero greenhouse gas goals measurement.
Yeah, and Jill, I mean, again, very, very similar, but from our aspect, stakeholders for us engage, it's not only because we have such a variety of supply chain and the way we work with our suppliers, right? So the stakeholders, of course, is our supply chain. Our organization is a little bit different. So our procurement team does not own the relationships with our suppliers. So our suppliers are owned, that relationship is really held internally with the business owner and the business unit. So as we continue kind of to engage with, I'll tell you right now, we've been on this journey since 2016, and there's always a new stakeholder every week. But I think that's kind of the fun of it, is the fact that we get to work internally with all of these different organizations and team members and everybody else. And for our benefit, we also have now beneficially tied some compensation to some ESG metrics, which has been really beneficial because now everybody's a stakeholder in the organization, the business, because we've tied kind of that to that. Everyone's compensation has a little bit of that, or from our executive, from that little bit of ESG perspective, our executive. So that's kind of a huge tied in. So everyone now is a stakeholder. So from that perspective, right, stakeholders are suppliers, stakeholders are our employees who are working every day with these suppliers, as well as our business units, procurements. And as we go down this journey, it's difficult because the stakeholders are constantly changing and evolving, and you need to kind of bring them along with the journey, because this is not their day-to-day job. They're not necessarily, their goal from working with a supplier or an external stakeholder is to get the job at the cheapest value, get with the best price for what they actually need for the best product, and then kind of ESG comes third. So how do we bring that in and incorporate that? That's one thing that we've really I work with stakeholders, is trying to get them to understand. And a lot of that is through education and communication.
I want to reinforce that because I meant to mention it too, that, yeah, the stakeholder list, it's not static. It changes as your business evolves, especially if your business is growing or shrinking or you're acquiring businesses. I mean, the stakeholder list changes constantly. So yeah, just also going into this process, understanding that is really important.
Cool. That's so interesting. So Sia, you mentioned compensation of like a specific tactic. Do either of you have ideas for other tactics or strategies that you feel have worked really well during this process? I mean, one thing that I don't know if I've done with either of you yet, but I know I've done with our other clients is like, sometimes we have a happy hour. We have like an event to like try to talk about this a little bit more and help use it as a team building opportunity. Have either of you found that approach to be useful? Other specifics?
Yeah, I have a couple examples. Well, yeah, tying to compensation is one, and also just generally adding this to people's goals. You know, when you're going through your annual review process, if you have a process for reviews and goal setting, I think it's really important to get these types of goals into you know, your internal stakeholders and kind of subject matter experts, right? So our procurement team has goals related to embodied carbon, for example. So I think that's important, and I think internal education is important, and we do that in many ways. You know, one is, you know, our CEO has company-wide town halls every month, right? So just a couple weeks ago, we presented on greenhouse gases and net zero and kind of did like a 101 for the entire company. And so I think that's really important, and that just the education is important. This is a pretty complicated technical topic. And so just the more you kind of socialize it, the more people understand, you know, what role they can play in it, and also just kind of be, you know, thankful to work at a company that's focused on this. I think that's also a good benefit. And also another thing that I do is more just kind of internal networking and relationship building. You know, our teams are kind of leaders, you know, I'm thinking not at the C level, but that level, but also kind of, you know, our, you know, SVP level or EVP level. They have their own staff meetings, and they often invite me to speak on these efforts, right? So just little ways that you can kind of get in front of people, I think, is really important. And you know, find those folks who really care about this and let them help you continue the conversation.
Yeah, Jill, are very, very similar. Like a lot of what we found successful is actually engaging with being at those meetings, right? So like every business owner has that like quarterly update, or even like weekly or bi-weekly. So once people are educated, it's less scary. When you first say net zero and scope 3 is 80%, we need to reduce our supply chain emissions. People are just like, stop talking. I have no idea what you're talking about. Whoa, that's really scary. I can't do it. But once you start like breaking down what those actual tactical steps are and like how they can help engage them. And I also find, so outside of kind of that, giving them actual something that they can do, right? So like, how can I engage? My kind of recommendation is like, one time it's someone's like, well, I don't know how to even begin the supplier. And it's like, well, we would encourage you for your supply chain or your supplier to make sure when they're invited to, we use CDP supply chain to collect our supplier information. Ensure that they're responding to the CDP supply chain, like communicate how important it is that they need to respond. If they don't know what to do, you can, you know, if they come back to you and say, we're not doing it, we've never started greenhouse gas emissions, bring them to our group. We have resources internally. We can bring them in and kind of like help them along their journey. So I think that's kind of the best thing, is giving people tactical and like realistic steps to reach, because when someone says net zero and doesn't show the step-by-step, it concerns a lot of people. There's a lot of immediate concern and pushback.
So, I mean, let's dive straight into that. I mean, how do you, when you are having those conversations and you're in that space, but you need to take action, what are the points at which you feel like you've been able to push folks to really take action or really change hearts and minds in order to make this a viable opportunity for them? I mean, you both have been so successful in doing that in some really incredible ways. Would love to hear more about your experience.
Yeah, so I mean, for us, a lot of it is, I find, at least in MasterCard, the culture is very much, our culture has always been doing well by doing good. Doing good by doing well, sorry. Doing good by doing well. Two interchangeable words. That's kind of like everyone's kind of thought process in there. So we really haven't had a lot of pushback of someone being like, no, we're not going to do it. No, that's not something we're interested in. The biggest challenge and obstacle is the education piece. This isn't their day-to-day jobs. And I mean, I'm going to use I, as an ESG professional or environmental professional, still don't necessarily have a full grasp of managing and kind of reducing our scope 3 and supply chain. So how can I expect someone with no experience and no knowledge to feel that same way? So I personally, as I said, have been successful by giving tactical and like actual steps that they could take, either both internally, right? So internally with business owners, but even with our suppliers, because coming to them saying, well, we have this net zero goal, how are you going to help us get there, is a lot scarier than coming back and saying, hey, we need you to report your scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. Then coming back and be like, great, you did your scope 1 and 2. Let's do your scope 3. Great, now that you have a baseline, let's set a science-based target. Let's reduce it. Okay, now that you have a science-based target and you're on this reduction path, let's see what the next steps are. Let's do renewable energy. There are a lot of like steps to get them to where they need to be. And that's kind of how I've found that we've been most successful, is by providing that internal expertise and also collaborating with them. So saying, okay, what do you need to get, to get where you need to go? How can we partner on this? And that's been both successfully internally and externally, because net zero sounds like such a far concept that it's difficult for people to understand.
Yeah, I think from what I said, as being just one part of a very massive global company, setting the context and what this means outside of a person's kind of day-to-day world is really important for us. It's one thing for me as an ESG leader within our development group to say, oh, you need to do LEED certification and you need to reduce embodied carbon and so on and so forth. But, for them, they just look at how that might impact, how they're designing their project or the cost, how it's increasing their budget or whatever they perceive to be the challenge related to that. And I think setting the stage for, look, you're part of this big machine, right? This big machine, and everything that we're doing is going to roll up and be aggregated. So we need to play our part. And I think that helps people. They understand the perspective. They understand that it's a bigger commitment than just them or me or even our portfolio company, right? It's kind of contributing to the whole and improving the planet overall, right? And improving our company's performance overall and responding to what our investors want. If we don't do this, we're not going to have money to do other projects because our investors are demanding it, right? So helping them understand the context is important for us. And, I also think meeting people where they are is important. We have, I guess, real estate developers are very smart, but they're very focused on kind of the region and the market they're working on, the specific product type they're working on, multifamily buildings or retail buildings. And so, to kind of break them out of their, hyper real estate is local world, they need to, you kind of have to meet them there and help them understand that, okay, the building next door might not be going after these strategies, but this is part of an asset and an investment that Brookfield is a steward of. And so we have a different expectation for our investments than, the apartment building next door, and helping explain that is really important. And I guess one more thing I would add is, finding who the folks in your business, if not everybody is sort of on the same page or at the same level of maturity about these types of topics, find the folks who are, or who are very interested in it. Who are your internal champions that are willing to pilot a strategy for you that you can then share across the business? Or where have you done something, an embodied carbon reduction successfully in your business? Because that makes it very real for folks. It takes it from being this, oh my gosh, scope 3, stop talking, this is scary, I don't understand it, to like, oh, at that project in Los Angeles, they reduced it by 24%. And all they had to do was work with their structural engineer and their concrete supplier. Like, that's real to them. They know that project, they know that team, they know they can learn that it didn't cost more. And it was just a matter of paying attention to it. So I think the real world examples, especially if they're internal or something a peer has done, is very meaningful.
Totally. Wow, that's as someone with a background in community organizing, that really resonates with me, because the idea of creating an affinity group, or really connecting with folks who are passionate to demonstrate that expertise is like, anyway, there's been a lot of scholarship that's gone into talking about that as a strategy. So anyway, I just, wow, what a great connection that is also a tactic that you can use in the ESG in the corporate world. That's super cool. Awesome. Cool. The next thing I wanted to ask you both today is, and this is related, but I think going a little deeper into what you were just talking about, is as a part of this engagement process, how then did you determine your priorities? I mean, Jill, you just mentioned looking at concrete and steel as a first step. I know from my work in the built environment, those are pretty heavy emitters. So maybe there were some things that were just materially obvious after conducting a very brief initial analysis. But were there other factors or things that were interesting during that process?
Yeah, I think for us, you're exactly right. You know, we found a couple of projects, you know, in design where we could conduct a whole building life cycle analysis, because for us, you know, the building materials is where the majority of our scope 3 emissions are. And, you know, once you have that, you know, all the buildings we build are made of the same stuff, right? They all have concrete, they all have steel, they all have wood, they all have drywall, you know. And so you're you know, once you kind of do one or two life cycle assessments, you kind of understand what the big offenders are in terms of embodied carbon and scope 3. And so for us, it's concrete, it's the metal, it's the glass, you know. And so that was enough to give us a starting point. You know, we knew that focusing on those, you know, top 3 or 5 categories of materials would give us kind of the biggest bang for our buck in terms of embodied carbon reduction. So, you know, that's how we started, or one way we've started. But another one is, you know, we do have a lot of other suppliers that are smaller sources of scope 3 emissions, but they're a little bit easier to tackle, right? You know, we're going to have a different concrete supplier on every project, but we have national agreements with the same cabinet manufacturers or countertop manufacturers and the same paint companies, right? And even though those are kind of drops in the bucket in terms of the whole building carbon impacts of our buildings, it's a little bit easier. I say easier, a little bit easier to measure the impacts of those materials, because we have those existing relationships. We're kind of putting in the same products at all of our buildings. And so I think for those, we can kind of, those are sort of like the low-hanging fruit that we can tackle. You know, we have a good relationship with those suppliers. We have already vetted them generally in terms of their ESG efforts. And so we can dive a little bit deeper to figure out if they have EPDs for their products that we can help start to measure, and just have an open dialogue with them. So yeah, so it's kind of twofold. Like, what are the big offenders that are probably a little more complicated and different from project to project, but also what are we doing the same everywhere and have good relationships, and we already know they're good products. So how do we just kind of close the loop on those and get the data we need?
Yeah, and I think you're right, Jill, is kind of once you start doing that baseline, you kind of can see where the biggest impacts are. But I would also say from our perspective, right, we're also looking at internal finishes, which is a little bit different. So yes, like the concrete and the steel are always going to be big ones, but how can we work with the existing, like, things that are changeable, right? For us, it's very difficult. Electrical systems, I'll be very honest, electrical systems are huge carbon emitters. Do we have as much of a pull on electrical suppliers and components? Not really. Can we make a better choice in picking the finishings? Carpet, drywall, even some extent concrete, chairs, lighting, like all of these other things. Can we make a difference? So how can we change those products in which there are alternatives? How can we ensure that we're going to make those smart choices? How do we ensure that it's built into our design and our process to actually start making those choices for what exists, while still tackling the parts that are going to be much more difficult? But how do we start? We're still focused on it, but it's a lot easier to go knowing that you have like an interface and, you know, all of these other organizations that are focused on that embodied carbon. How do we make sure those choices are made before, you know, immediately, so then we can, as like a, I want to say, there's no question about it, right? So it's an immediate, like, we're gonna use the lowest emitting carpet, we're gonna use the lowest emitting embedded chair or whatever it is. Those are already decided. So we can have that built into our process. There's no question. So then we can start focusing on the ones that are a little bit more challenging. Steel, I would say concrete, electrical, all of those things. That would be additionally. And I think it's also knowing I'm going to zoom out from like a larger supplier, not just like embodied carbon and built environment. It's knowing where everybody is in the industry and knowing kind of where that industrial spot is. It's much easier to have conversations and make changes with people who are farther along in their game, like in their space. So like technology, I'll just use Dell as an example. Dell is potentially looking at now putting out greenhouse gas footprints for every single product that you buy. So it's much easier to work with Adele and make those changes than perhaps a sponsorship or a marketing engagement where they're not quite as sophisticated. So it's also knowing where in the industry you can make those choices and making those naturally or embedding it into your process, and then really focusing in on the areas in which you need to engage, and there needs to be systemic change.
I might add that another thing we keep an eye on is, as a building developer, we're subject to, codes and regulations in different states and jurisdictions. And so, in terms of prioritization, we try to keep an eye on those codes and regulations. And, some states are starting to go towards looking at building materials and regulating that. And so, we want to try to stay ahead of that, or if we're going to pilot certain projects, like let's do it in California because we know it's coming, right? And so that's another way to help prioritize generally is if you're looking, to try something out, or a regulation is being discussed or proposed somewhere, maybe focus some initial efforts in that market, because you're going to have to respond to it anyway and build to those standards anyway. So that's something else we try to keep in mind. And also, what are our peers doing? What are our peers doing? Because there are competition. And also, if we're going to be building and selling a building, what are the buyers looking for? Do they have net zero goals? Do they want all this data and information as we transfer that property? So that's something else that we look at in terms of prioritizing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I feel like more and more tenant organizations are starting to have net zero goals of their own, which is exciting. And in some ways, like very serendipitous, because that sets you up as a great option for that, because you have so far. That's really exciting. Awesome. The next thing I wanted to talk to you both about, and I want to leave some time for audience Q&A, but I really wanted to hear from you both about how this effort has changed your procurement and supplier vetting process, and just thoughts on partnership and collaboration. You both have given some great shout outs to organizations that have been partners in this work, as you've looked at alternative procurement from everything from office furniture to the buildings and structures themselves, depending on your line of work. But would just love to hear you speak more about how that process has gone.
I guess I can start, see it, unless you want to. So we have a very strong center-led procurement team, which helps a lot when you're doing this type of work. So I've mentioned some ways that we're collaborating already. We already have supplier relationships, and when we vet new suppliers, we include ESG screeners, and we have these discussions with them to make sure they have products that are going to align with our goals.
So do you? Not sorry to interrupt, but do you have like are you asking your suppliers to meet certain benchmarks before you?
We're not asking them to meet certain benchmarks. We kind of want to keep the relationship open. We want to meet them where they are. First and foremost, the product has to be, affordable and a high quality product, right? But we do care very much about how those products contribute to us achieving our sustainability goals and net zero goals. And so we won't discount a supplier, but we want to make sure that they're willing to work with us. You know, you can't create your own net zero goal overnight, but we want to make sure they have an eye on this. They're willing to kind of come along with us on the journey, if you will. So it's more of a conversation at this point in time for us. So we're not terribly strict about it yet, but we want to make sure that they, you know, they have product that's going to help us, or that they're at least researching that. And another thing that we're doing with procurement, just this year, our procurement team has designated a specific person to focus on ESG and kind of keep their eye on the ball. It's not a new resource, but they've kind of made it part of one of their teams, one of their person's jobs, just to be kind of the conduit for ESG, you know, to work with our sustainability team, and to make sure that they're on top of it in all their different sets, from like sourcing new suppliers or tracking existing product and all of that. So that's really exciting. And I think, you know, it's going to help us kind of accelerate these efforts going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was about to say ours is similar as well, but a little bit. I mean, it's very similar. I don't think there's much discrepancy. Sorry, Jill, we're there, but we also have just actually, if anybody is looking for opportunities, we have 2 new job opportunities sitting within our procurement organization for ESG. So kind of like holistically looking there. I think this is going to be significantly more common in the future, especially with the SEC regulations coming out with the risk, you know, and everything else in a high kind of look at from that perspective. So Jill covered everything that I was going to say. And in this case, we're very similar. There's nothing else I can add.
That's awesome. Well, it's just fantastic, because when you are doing that work with your suppliers, and as you say, Jill, meeting them where they're at and then having that conversation, like you're really shifting and transforming the market beyond your own organization. So that way, even organizations that are not as advanced in their thinking around this or their work, like they're benefiting from the work that you're doing around this as well. And I just think that is so powerful and fantastic. So just
yeah, I just want to say, I think asking the question is the most important thing you can do as a sustainability practitioner, right? For almost everybody you interact with, in particular your suppliers. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I still think that's kind of the best thing you can do. You know, ask your suppliers what they're doing on this. Like, have they ever been asked the question? Because the more of us customers that ask them that question, the more they're going to think about it, the more they're going to hire somebody to focus on it, and the more they're going to realize they may lose out on customers or us as a huge client and customer if they're not kind of keeping up with these trends. And so I think it sparks a lot of really interesting conversation. Sometimes it's really interesting the answers you get back, but asking the question is really important. It's probably the number one thing we can do, just to socialize this, and that it's important, and they're going to be hearing this from more than just us if we're the first company they've heard it from.
Yeah, and I would duly say that it's also seen more when you're starting to use like some of these joint together supply chains, whether it be like supply chain tools, whether it be like CDP supply chain, EcoVadis, and other things, because it's not just one person asking the question, it's multiple people. And there's actually, I don't know if any of you have ever responded to a CDP, but you like log in and it's like, we as MasterCard, right? So I'm the perspective of a supplier now. I log in and here's like the 15 list of all of our customers who are asking us to fill this out. And the more impactful, like that bigger that number gets, the more impactful it is, because they're getting asked a lot more. And I also see it from that perspective as well. It's being considered in a lot more RFPs in general. So that's kind of not only once you're a supplier, but once you start, you even to get into a supplier are now having to start answering questions about your own greenhouse gas emissions, your own targets, and everything else. And the percentage of that part of the RFP used to be a just nice to know. And now, even from our perspective, for our suppliers and those questions, it's starting to become a little bit bigger, and it's going to continue to grow, especially I think, especially as this market continues to progress. And people need to start hitting their net zero goals. I'm not saying there's the Salesforce exhibit if anybody wants a lovely read, but it's out there. It might give you a heart attack, it's fine. But those are kind of where the industry is in generally going. And we anticipate in general, it may not be that harsh, but it is starting to go in that realm.
Awesome.
I'll get Salesforce plug here.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no.
I use their
absolutely.
exhibit all the time.
Yeah, they're another fantastic client of ours. And I think if you all want to hear from them, they're joining Jill and I in a conversation at the Living Future Unconference around these same topics on May 13th, I believe, at the same time. So more to come from them if you're interested. But awesome. I have one more question for the two of you, and then I want to open it up to the audience. And that is really, how can others duplicate and scale this process? You've mentioned jumping in on influencing the supply chain through procurement and other opportunities. I'm seeing we have some owners, some developers, and some green building industry folks on our audience today. But knowing this is going to be recorded and going out to a broader audience, if you have any tips, tricks, or suggestions, this would be a great time to share them. I know folks are very interested.
I can jump in on this one. I mean, every company and business is going to be, and industry is different, so we'll just start there. But I mean, I think you've already heard a lot of similarities in our processes, so hopefully everybody's kind of taking notes, or they can view the recording and take some notes. I mean, one thing I would recommend is that I have found very useful as part of the real estate industry is to get involved in industry groups and associations that are focused on sustainability, because you'll have kind of an instant group of peers who are all working towards similar goals. And in the real estate industry, at least, we're all very willing to share knowledge and lessons learned and consultants that work for us. And, you know, how are we tracking regulations in different markets? And we can even, get sophisticated around like lobbying on behalf of our industry, when it comes to environmental regulation. And I think, for me, there are a couple of really amazing groups in the US in real estate focused on this, and that has been like invaluable because it's likely you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Someone's already thought about this, and so you don't have to start from zero. So I would just do some research, get involved with groups that have similar businesses to yours, and learn from what they've already done. And then I think for us, look at your existing processes if you're a process-oriented organization, and figure out where you can easily integrate sustainability and greenhouse gas measurement and reductions into things that you're already doing. I mean, there's got to be low-hanging fruit there, and once you understand what you need to measure and manage, figure out where it's happening and see if there are some tweaks you can insert into the process rather than creating a whole entire new process. I mean, that might not work for every company or for a decentralized organization, but it may work in some aspects. Where can you integrate it? And also, I guess the last thing I'll say, and I've mentioned this before, but figure out who your allies are internally, who is interested in this personally, who can affect change through their day-to-day job, and kind of how do you work with them and collaborate them to kind of push the boundaries and create some pilot projects and initiatives that then you can share with everyone else to bring them along on this journey.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the first step is seeing where it naturally can fit into your, not necessarily your process, but naturally where it fits. So does it make sense in an RFP phase? Like, is that where you start gathering information? Also, what tools are you currently using that you potentially can turn on a feature to, right? So that's something that I also encourage everyone to look at. Is there are a lot of organizations, I don't know everybody's like own procurement software or everything else, but you'd be surprised at how many of these softwares already have tools built in that whoever set up the tool didn't know that they can click a button and it not all of a sudden has a question on where they sit on sustainability or an ESG, or can pull in Dow Jones sustainability scores or whatever it is. Kind of look at the tools that you have, because this is not going away, and I just see more of it. For example, I know Coupa, like I don't know if anybody uses Coupa, but Coupa now has a lot of tools. They're working internally to turn on all these tools in existing processes. So also, I would encourage to also kind of look not only where it fits in your process, but see what your existing tools can do, and you'd be surprised at how much I personally think you can get done with what you already have before you start investing in creating new processes. that would be my addition of what Jill said.
Well said. Awesome. Awesome. Do we have any audience questions? Any thoughts? RJ, I saw you put an awesome link in the chat. Thank you for that. If not, we might go ahead and we could probably close a little bit early, but I just thank you so much, Jill and Sia. Your thoughts on this are so incredibly helpful. And I learned, we've had this conversation before, but I learned something new every time you talk. And I just want to thank you so much for all the great work that you're doing to move the industry forward. It's really, really exciting. And it's a pleasure to be a part of it.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for having us.
Just wanted to thank you all, Suni, Jill, and Sia. This is incredibly eye-opening. I mean, we all know the word Scope 3, but to really kind of, I've learned a lot today. I think our guests have learned a lot today. I really appreciate you all being a part of our Sustainable Building Week. We've recorded this, so we'll be putting this on the website so other folks can learn from that, and we'll be doing some social media posts to that effect. So thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks for organizing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Take care.